Thanksgiving at my Aunt Carol's house was never about gratitude. It was about hierarchy. Every year, the same polished oak tables stretched across her dining room like a throne room for the self-appointed royalty of our family. Crystal glasses, gold-trimmed plates, perfectly folded napkins. The adult table. And then there was the folding table in the corner. Short legs, plastic cups, cartoon turkey napkins bought in bulk. The kids' table. I'm 32 years old. I own a growing logistics company in Chicago. I paid off my student loans before I turned 28. I employ 12 people. But this year, when I walked in with a homemade pecan pie and a bottle of aged bourbon, Aunt Carol glanced at me the way someone looks at an uninvited plus one. Smile too tight. Eyes too sharp. She said we had to make a small adjustment this year. Too many important guests. Not enough seats at the main table. I'd be more comfortable with the younger crowd anyway. The younger crowd included my 14-year-old cousin Dylan and 3 elementary school kids who still believed in the tooth fairy. For a second, I thought she was joking. Then I saw my name written in black marker on a paper turkey taped to a plastic cup. Laughter floated from the dining room. My Uncle Robert avoided eye contact. My cousin Melissa smirked while adjusting her diamond bracelet like she'd just witnessed something mildly entertaining. I felt heat crawl up my neck. It wasn't about the chair. It wasn't about the folding table. It was the message. You don't belong here. This wasn't new. Growing up, I was the quiet one. The awkward one. The kid whose dad lost his job and whose mom worked double shifts. The one who wore clearance clothes and brought store-brand soda to family barbecues. They used to whisper about our phase. Apparently, in their minds, I never outgrew it. I could have left. I almost did. My car keys were heavy in my pocket. The cold November air outside would have been easier to swallow than this humiliation. But then I heard something. Aunt Carol's voice drifted from the kitchen, sharp and careless. She said at least putting me at the kids' table meant the adult conversation wouldn't be interrupted by someone trying to prove themselves. That's when something inside me shifted. Because the truth is, I didn't come to prove myself. I came with something else entirely. And by the end of this Thanksgiving, nobody at that oak table would ever look at me the same way again. I took my seat at the kids' table. The plastic chair wobbled slightly under my weight. Dylan gave me a half-smirk, half-sympathetic look, like he wasn't sure whether to laugh or apologize. The younger kids were too busy arguing over who got the last dinner roll to notice the tension orbiting the room. From where I sat, I had a clear view of the adult table. Uncle Robert carving the turkey like he was performing surgery. Aunt Carol hovering, correcting his grip. Melissa scrolling through her phone under the tablecloth. Her husband, Brian, nodding along to conversations about investments he barely understood. They didn't see me as a threat. That was their first mistake. I pulled out my phone, not to scroll, not to distract myself, but to check the time. For 17 p.m. Right on schedule. Across town, a courier was probably walking into a glass office building with a slim black envelope. Inside it was a document that would tilt the balance of power in this family for good. Uncle Robert loved control. He prided himself on being the financial backbone of the family. He reminded everyone that he helped my parents once, years ago. He never mentioned the interest he charged or the way he used it as leverage at every reunion. What nobody at the adult table knew was that 6 months ago, Robert approached my company for a quiet solution to a louder problem. A distribution issue in one of his regional warehouses. He didn't recognize my name on the proposal at first. When he did, he pretended it was coincidence. He signed anyway. Desperation makes people careless. The contract he signed included more than logistics support. It included an option clause. One his lawyer skimmed. One he assumed I would never exercise. The option matured today. Back at the adult table, laughter erupted over some story about golf club memberships. Aunt Carol glanced toward me and then quickly away, satisfied that the natural order of things had been restored. She had no idea that by the time dessert was served, her husband's largest warehouse would legally belong to my company. I didn't plan it this way at first. Business is business. But when I received the call last week confirming the activation window aligned with Thanksgiving, I saw something poetic in the timing. Dylan nudged me, asking why I looked so calm. I told him I was just hungry. What I really was patient. My phone vibrated softly in my hand. A single notification. Documents delivered. I looked up at the adult table again. They were still carving turkey. They just didn't realize they were about to be carved out of something much bigger. The notification wasn't the victory. It was the beginning. I kept my expression neutral and reached for the mashed potatoes while the kids argued about video games. Across the room, Uncle Robert lifted his wine glass and began one of his annual speeches about family legacy and smart decisions. The irony almost made me smile. His phone buzzed. He ignored it. It buzzed again. Aunt Carol shot him an annoyed look, the kind that said deal with it quietly. He reached into his pocket, glanced at the screen, and frowned. Just slightly. Most people wouldn't have noticed. I did. He stood up, muttering something about an urgent matter, and stepped into the hallway. The dining room noise resumed, but it had shifted. A subtle ripple had passed through it. Melissa leaned toward Brian, whispering. Brian shrugged. No one looked at the kids' table. My phone vibrated again. Confirmation received. Option executed. Ownership transfer initiated. Clean. Legal. Irreversible. In the hallway, Robert's voice grew sharper. Not loud, but tight. Controlled panic. The kind of tone a man uses when he realizes he underestimated someone. He walked back into the dining room slower than before. His face had changed. The confidence wasn't gone, but it had cracks in it now. Aunt Carol asked if everything was fine. He nodded too quickly. Then he looked around the table, scanning faces, calculating. His eyes passed over me at first. Then they stopped. For a brief second, our gazes locked. Recognition flickered. He picked up his glass again, but this time his hand wasn't steady. Conversation resumed, but he wasn't leading it anymore. He was distracted. Listening for his phone. Waiting for another message. It came. This time, everyone heard the vibration against the wooden table. He didn't excuse himself. He checked it right there. His jaw tightened. Melissa noticed. She asked what was wrong. He forced a smile and said it was just a minor contract update. Minor. At the kids' table, Dylan leaned toward me and asked why Uncle Robert looked like he swallowed something bad. I told him sometimes adults choke on things they thought they could control. Robert's eyes found mine again. And this time, he knew. He knew exactly who had just pulled the ground from beneath his feet. But the best part was this. He still didn't know how far it was going to fall. Dinner moved forward, but the rhythm was off. Uncle Robert barely touched his food. He kept checking his phone under the table, thinking no one noticed. Aunt Carol tried to fill the silence with forced cheer, complimenting the cranberry sauce, asking the kids about school projects, pretending the atmosphere hadn't shifted. But tension has a smell. And it was spreading. My phone buzzed one more time. Final confirmation. Transfer completed. Asset secured. That was my cue. I stood up from the kids' table. Plastic chair scraping against tile. Every head turned, some amused, some confused. Aunt Carol's smile returned, the one she used when a child interrupted adult conversation. She asked if I needed more gravy. I walked toward the adult table instead. Slow. Calm. I placed my glass of water down near Uncle Robert's plate. Close enough for him to hear me clearly. Far enough that no one could accuse me of causing a scene. I congratulated him on finalizing the warehouse transition. The room froze. Melissa blinked. Brian looked between us like he had missed a chapter. Aunt Carol's smile collapsed. Robert tried to control the narrative. He said it was a routine restructuring. Standard corporate movement. I nodded and clarified that the option clause he signed 6 months ago had matured today, transferring full operational ownership to my company effective immediately. Silence dropped heavy over the table. Aunt Carol asked what that meant. It meant that the largest distribution hub under Robert's portfolio now answered to me. It meant I could renew his management contract at a reduced rate. Or terminate it. It meant the same man who placed me at a folding table was now dependent on my decision to maintain his executive title. Robert's face hardened. He asked if this was some kind of stunt. I told him it was business. The same business he insisted I wouldn't understand years ago. Dylan let out a low whistle from behind me. The younger kid sensed something dramatic but didn't understand it. The adults understood perfectly. Aunt Carol whispered that this was family. I agreed. That was exactly why I chose today. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a thin folder. Inside was a printed copy of the executed transfer summary. I slid it across the oak table. The same table I apparently didn't qualify to sit at. And then I did something no one expected. I pulled out the empty chair at the head of the table. And I sat down. The chair at the head of the table had always belonged to Uncle Robert. It creaked as I settled into it. No one spoke. Aunt Carol looked like someone had turned off the gravity in the room. Melissa's phone lay forgotten beside her plate. Brian stared at the folder as if it might rearrange itself into better news. Robert leaned forward slowly, hands clasped together, studying me with a look I had seen before. The same look he used on struggling employees he planned to replace. Cold assessment. He said I was making a mistake. He reminded me that contracts can be contested. Lawyers can stretch timelines. Courts can delay transitions for months, even years. His voice regained some of its edge. He thought he found leverage. I let him finish. Then I reminded him that the option clause had a pre-authorized arbitration waiver. Binding. Expedited. Signed by him personally. No courtroom. No delays. No dramatic appeals. I watched the realization land again, heavier this time. Across the table, Aunt Carol's composure cracked. She asked why I would do this to family. Why humiliate them over a seating arrangement? That almost made me laugh. This was never about a chair. It was about a pattern. Years of subtle reminders. Loans with strings attached. Jokes about my parents' struggles. Comments about how some people in the family knew how to succeed while others just tried. They never saw what I was building. They assumed I was still trying to catch up. They never imagined I was planning 3 moves ahead. Robert shifted tactics. He softened his tone and suggested we discuss terms privately. Just the two of us. Man to man. That was the moment I knew he was worried. Because powerful men do not negotiate in whispers unless they are losing. I shook my head. Everything would be discussed right here. In front of everyone. If I was small enough for the kids' table, I was visible enough for the truth. His phone buzzed again. He glanced at it and went pale. I didn't need to see the screen to know what it said. The executive team at the warehouse had just received notification of the ownership change. My name was now on their internal dashboard. Authority recognized. Aunt Carol asked what would happen next. I leaned back slightly and folded my hands on the oak surface. That depended on how tonight unfolded. Because acquiring the warehouse was only the first step. And what I was about to say next would determine whether Robert kept his empire or watched the rest of it unravel before dessert. The room felt smaller. Even the air seemed cautious. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Then I explained that the warehouse was not an isolated asset. It was the central artery feeding 3 of Robert's other distribution contracts. If operations shifted under my policies, his profit margins would tighten within weeks. Brian finally spoke, asking what policies. Smart question. I outlined them calmly. Transparent auditing. Performance-based restructuring. Vendor renegotiations. The kind of changes that expose inflated expenses and questionable side agreements. Robert's jaw flexed. Because he knew exactly what that meant. Years ago, when he offered my parents financial help, the interest rate was technically legal but predatory. He called it risk adjustment. I called it exploitation. And he had used similar adjustments in business. Aunt Carol whispered that this was spiraling. She was right. But not in the direction she thought. My phone buzzed again. This time it was from my operations manager. The executive team at the warehouse had already scheduled an emergency call for tomorrow morning. They were requesting confirmation of leadership continuity. In other words, they wanted to know if Robert still had a job. I placed my phone face down on the table. Robert leaned forward, voice controlled but tight. He asked what I wanted. There it was. Not anger. Not threats. Terms. I told him I wanted fairness. Full disclosure audits across his connected contracts. Written acknowledgement that the loan he gave my parents would be considered settled in full, with interest recalculated and reimbursed. Publicly at the next family gathering. Melissa inhaled sharply. Aunt Carol shook her head, saying that was unnecessary. Necessary was relative. Robert studied me carefully. He tried one last angle. He said if I pushed too hard, the family would turn on me. No one likes someone who weaponizes success. I held his gaze. They already turned on me years ago. The difference now was that I had leverage. From the corner of the room, Dylan was watching with wide eyes. The kids had gone quiet. Even they sensed something historic unfolding. Robert's phone vibrated yet again. This time, he didn't check it. He already knew what it would say. Board members requesting clarification. Partners asking questions. Investors noticing the shift. The ground beneath him wasn't just cracking. It was sliding. I stood up slowly from the head of the table. I told him he had until dessert to decide. Cooperate, and he remains executive director under my oversight. Refuse, and tomorrow morning begins a full structural review that would not be gentle. Then I stepped away from the oak table, back toward the folding one. Because sometimes the most powerful move is walking away before the answer comes. I didn't return to the head of the table. I went back to the folding one. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. I picked up a dinner roll and buttered it like nothing historic had just unfolded. Dylan stared at me like I had just flipped the world upside down. The younger kids slowly resumed eating, though their eyes kept drifting toward the adults. At the oak table, the meeting had begun. No raised voices. No dramatic shouting. Just low, urgent conversation. Melissa leaned toward her father, her tone sharp. Brian kept whispering about reputational risk. Aunt Carol's face had drained of color, but she was calculating now, not emotional. Robert sat still at first. Then he stood. He walked to the hallway again, phone pressed to his ear. This time his voice wasn't controlled. It was clipped. Direct. Defensive. I checked my own phone. 3 missed calls from unknown numbers. 2 emails marked urgent. 1 message from my legal team confirming external acknowledgement of the transfer had been logged with state authorities. Official. Public. Traceable. No undo button. Robert returned to the table slower than before. His shoulders carried weight now. Not panic. Pressure. He didn't sit immediately. He looked at me across the room, measuring something. Then he addressed everyone. He said there had been an unexpected shift in one of his business units. He described it as strategic realignment. Temporary turbulence. He was protecting his image. But Melissa interrupted him. She asked directly if I now controlled the warehouse. The word controlled hung in the air like smoke. Robert hesitated. That was enough of an answer. Aunt Carol turned toward me from across the room. She asked if this was revenge. The question landed harder than anything else that night. Because revenge implies emotion. This wasn't emotional. This was structured. I stood again, not approaching the oak table this time, just speaking clearly enough for everyone to hear. I said this was correction. Years of imbalance don't fix themselves. Robert exhaled sharply, the first sign of visible frustration. He said business wasn't personal. I reminded him that he made it personal the moment he used financial leverage to shape family dynamics. Silence returned. Then his phone buzzed again. He checked it. And this time, something in his expression changed completely. Not anger. Not frustration. Concern. Deep concern. Because whatever message he just read wasn't about the warehouse. Robert lowered his phone slowly. The shift in his face was undeniable now. The warehouse had shaken him. This was something else. Melissa demanded to know what was happening. Brian stood halfway out of his chair. Aunt Carol gripped the edge of the table as if bracing for impact. Robert looked at me. Not with arrogance. Not with anger. With realization. I already knew. 3 months ago, during due diligence on the warehouse, my legal team uncovered something buried deep in supplier agreements tied to Robert's secondary distribution contracts. Inflated invoicing. Shell intermediaries. Quiet profit siphoning masked as consulting fees. Nothing flashy. Just enough to go unnoticed. Until it didn't. Tonight was never only about exercising the option clause. It was about timing. The message he had just received wasn't from his board. It was from his largest private investor. An investor who had also received an anonymous compliance packet earlier that afternoon. A packet outlining irregularities and recommending immediate internal review. I didn't send it anonymously. My firm did. Proper channels. Documented findings. Clean delivery. Robert asked me quietly how far this went. Far enough. If a forensic audit began tomorrow, his reputation would fracture long before any courtroom saw the inside of a file. Investors panic faster than families forgive. Aunt Carol whispered that this could destroy everything. I shook my head. No. This could reset everything. I stepped closer to the oak table one last time. I told Robert the same terms still stood. Full audit under my supervision. Immediate correction of exploitative contracts. Public acknowledgement regarding my parents. Formal partnership restructuring that removed hidden incentives. Agree tonight, and the compliance packet would be reframed as cooperative restructuring rather than exposure. Refuse, and the investors would escalate independently. The power in the room had fully inverted. Robert looked around the table. At his daughter. At his wife. At the empire he thought was immovable. Then he nodded. Not to the family. To me. Dessert was served 10 minutes later. Pumpkin pie. Pecan pie. Coffee poured into crystal cups. No one mentioned seating arrangements. And when plates were set out again, Aunt Carol quietly moved my name card. From the folding table. To the head of the oak one. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I simply took my seat. Because the lesson was never about humiliation. It was about alignment. And from that Thanksgiving forward, no one in that house ever confused silence for weakness again. If this story resonates you, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more interesting revenge stories. See you in the next one.